This is a bill that in ordinary times would not be controversial, but these are not ordinary times.
It's a fix of a bill that, through mischaracterization and confusion, has come to be greatly misunderstood.
2 Republican governors in full retreat this week over religious freedom bills they supported and then had to rework after protests the measures would allow discrimination against gays. And we're back now with a panel. Jason, what is your takeaway from the retreat, if you will? First of all, about the whole debate over religious freedom and the fact that the governors, as you saw here, of Arkansas and Indiana, after first saying they were going to sign these bills, then had to insist that they be reworked before they were finished with them.
Well, both sides are claiming intolerance here, but I think only one side is really guilty of hypocrisy. And that's what I see going on here. Hillary Clinton, who opposed gay marriage until 2 years ago, is tweeting about Indiana's intolerance. The Democratic governor of Connecticut, who banned state employees from traveling to Indiana, even though Connecticut has essentially the same law in place. So that's what I think is going on here. It is the height of hypocrisy. Positions held just a few years ago by Democrats are now considered anti-gay and bigotry in place.
Juan, let me pick up on that, because the initial push was that these laws and the people who supported them were being intolerant. The idea that a private business could discriminate, let's say, against participants in a gay marriage, that was intolerant. But you began to hear a pushback later, especially this week, that to insist that someone do something that violates their moral conviction, that's intolerant. How do you balance those two?
I think that's very hard to balance because, you know, someone who has religious beliefs myself, I want them to be respected. But I do think we're a nation of laws. And we're not a nation of religious beliefs. Everyone in our country can have their religious beliefs, but you have to come back to civil laws and liberties. And as such, I don't think there's any question that if the law specifies that you are open for business, whether it's gays or blacks, that under our laws, public accommodation laws, et cetera, that you have to treat people equally and fairly. That's the basis of our understanding. Now, I will say in response to Jason, there has been a tremendous shift in terms of American public opinion, and that's why I think you see people who 2 years ago may have had one position. I think President Obama says he's evolved on this issue. I think much of America has evolved and changed on this issue, and it's why you see corporate America taking the lead in this fight, by the way.
Jason, let me just pick up on this conversation between the two of you. I think you would certainly agree that if somebody came into the baker, you know, the proverbial baker who's getting a lot of business, this baker, and said, you know, an interracial marriage and we want a cake, I think you would say that that's outrageous, the idea that he would not participate in an interracial marriage. Why is that any different than a same-sex marriage?
We have anti-discrimination laws on the book. We have public accommodation laws on the books, and there's no indication that there's any pattern of courts allowing these laws, these religious freedom laws, to trump those laws. I think this is a straw man. This is being ginned up, and there's no reason we can't handle them on a case-by-case basis like we've been doing. But I do agree with Juan that there is an evolution in the country, particularly among young people, which is why you see some division even on the right about how to proceed with these culture wars, so to speak. This is very much a generational issue. And with the GOP out there looking at the next presidential election, wanting to appeal to younger voters, there's some indication that, you know, we've got other issues to talk about. Hillary's deleting emails, Obama's cutting deals with mullahs over nuclear weapons. Let's talk about those things. Those unite the party. They don't want to talk about
Can I just quickly say, before we let our friends in, that in fact, in Hobby Lobby, the Supreme Court said that in some cases where you have a family-owned business with strong religious beliefs, that you can take into consideration their faith with regard to providing contraception to women. And what we've seen in Indiana is different than Connecticut and these other states, because they would say it's not just a matter of government having to have a high bar in terms of putting any pressure on a religious belief, but individuals and corporations could now go to court and say, we're protected by the same kind of provisions.
We could continue this conversation, and I'm sure we will, but let's turn to the economy and some really disappointing numbers on the economy this week. Here they are. Only 126,000 jobs were added in March. That's the weakest hiring in 15 months. Labor force participation dropped to 62.7%, matching the lowest since 1978. And the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta estimates first quarter growth at 0%, flat. George, what's going on here?
Well, for the second year in a row, they've blamed poor quarterly growth on insufficient global warming, that is on winter, on an unusually cold winter. Let your mind go back to November last year. There was job creation of 321,000 jobs, and the administration said this is a miraculous achievement and a harbinger of things to come. It wasn't a harbinger and it wasn't miraculous. During the Reagan recovery, there were 23 months of job creation over 300,000. Reagan had a month of job creation of 1 million. And this was at a time when there were 75 million fewer Americans. Now, never mind zero growth. We are now being told, really, that 2% growth may be the new normal. If so, that's a disaster. Because every day, today, yesterday, tomorrow, every day between now and 2030, 10,000 more baby boomers become eligible for Social Security and Medicare. If we have 2% growth, the crisis of the welfare state, the crisis of the private sector, being able to throw off the revenues to pay the bills for the promises we've made to ourselves, becomes impossible.
Just tell again that the labor force participation stat that you have, if it were what it was at the beginning of the Obama administration.
If the workforce participation rate today were as high as it was on the day Barack Obama was inaugurated, the unemployment rate in this country would be 9.7%. We wouldn't be complaining about the bad recovery because we wouldn't call it a recovery.
All right, well, let's talk about the bad recovery, Mara. How concerned are they at the White House with these latest jobs numbers? Do they think it's more? Because one of the things that was talked about was we really had bad weather in the Northeast in March, and what do they think it says about the recovery?
Well, I think they are concerned, and it says the recovery can't seem to get any liftoff and stay there. I mean, one of the big things that Barack Obama said in his State of the Union address is it's time to turn the page. The recovery is growing, unemployment is down, deficit is down. Now it's time to talk about other things, how to get growth more broadly shared, inequality, all sorts of things like that. We don't even have growth now. I think this does shift the big economic debate in the country back to just getting growth, because you can't talk about it being more widely shared if you don't have it.
But you got to think with the divisions between the Republican Congress and the White House, there's nothing that they, the president talks about job stimulus, things like that. Nothing he proposes is going to get.
No, absolutely not. Nothing is going to happen.
Worse than
I
that,
don't think that they expect that, though. I do think what they were hoping to do was at least lay the table for 2016, get the kind of themes and frame the debate the way he wanted to, not necessarily pass things through Congress, with the exception of a few little things like trade, maybe some corporate tax reform.
That's what I was going to say. I think it's even worse than that, because I think your Congress is talking about sequestration. They cannot pass the kind of infrastructure support, the Highway Trust Fund bill. So essentially, Congress is not contributing to this. And I would add that there are lots of people, George, in our society that are retiring, that are reaching that baby boomer age you were referring to. And I think that's part of the labor force participation equation.
But I think this president is perfectly happy with this supposed new normal. I mean, this is someone who looks at the social welfare states of Europe with their higher unemployment rates and lower productivity than we have here, and sees them not as cautionary tales, but as models for us to emulate. He wants more entitlements. He's willing to trade for that lower productivity, less labor participation rate for these cradle-to-grave entitlements and so forth, more social spending. Yeah.
Jason, one perhaps good piece of news that comes out of all this is that the Federal Reserve had been kind of shaking the cage, talking about that they were about to, or shortly, going to start lifting short-term interest rates, and everybody thinks now that Fed Reserve Chairman Janet Yellen may have to hold off because of this.
Well, that was always the question with her, whether she would take away the punch bowl when it was time to do so. But to tell you the truth, Chris, if 25 or 50 basis points, if the economy is that fragile that would be tossed back into recession because of that, we're in much, much worse shape than the White House is acknowledging.
So, anyway, not out of the woods yet. Thank you all, panel. See you all next week.